Tuia te moana, tuia te herenga tangata, ka rongo te pō, ka rongo te ao, tihei mauri ora kia tātou. A mihi kawana kia tātou e pai nei. Ki te kanohi ora o rātou mā ko whetūrangitia, anō reira ngā whakaro nui ki o tātou ma te huhua o te wā ka tukuna haere fo atu ki Hawaii ki rangi o Kioki. Hoki mai ki a tātou, te kanohi ora, ngā waihotanga iho o rātou mā tēnā koutou. Tēnā tātou mōrena, and acknowledgements to us all this morning. Just quickly welcoming us all, acknowledging our dearly departed today as we do, and welcoming us back here to our rolling symposium. Ko Josh Te Kani ahau. I'm the Vision Mātauranga Knowledge Broker for the Resilience to Nature's Challenges Science Challenge. And it's great to welcome you back if you've been a part of our rolling symposium. And if you're new to the scene, welcome and make yourself at home. I hope you've got a cup of tea in hand ready for our kōrero this morning. We are expecting over 200 participants in our webinar for this third installment, which is of course leading up to our on the ground event happening next week. But before we get into more detail, I'll just extend a welcome to all that are present so far. Central and local government representatives, industry bodies as well as those people that are on the ground, our farmers and growers, policy makers, researchers, and the many skills pukenga that you bring to the table as well. Thank you for joining us this morning. So I might just quickly pass it over to Annabelle to introduce herself. She's not only the technical expert here, but also the backbone of our webinar.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Annabelle McAleer toka ingoa. I'm the Senior Communications Advisor for the Our Land and Water National Science Challenge. So today, if you're not aware, you're in part 3 of what we're calling a rolling symposium, which is a concept that we made up to share some science in advance of an in-person one-day symposium on Monday. So it's a collaboration between 3 of the National Science Challenges. The previous 2 webinars were led by the Deep South Challenge and Resilience to Nature's Challenges. I can share some video links to those webinars for you to watch later. Our Land and Water is the National Science Challenge with the mission to preserve the most fundamental treasures of Aotearoa, our land and water, while producing value from those treasures. We fund a major research program that you'll hear about in today's webinar, Land Use Opportunities Whitiwhiti Ora, which builds on an earlier research program called Land Use Suitability, and you'll also hear a little bit of research from that program today. Kia ora.
Awesome. It's very much a collaborative effort, and the first of its kind, this rolling symposium or webinars leading up to our symposium next week on the ground. I hope you've already registered for that because numbers are filling up fast, but you can do that online as well. As Annabelle mentioned, this is the 3rd webinar in our series leading up to our on-the-ground event. So in the first webinar, we had the future for farmers and growers. We had Andrew Tate from NIWA along with Susan Rosier, who really talked around drought modelling, and also with Luke Harrington in there around extreme weather modelling as well. That pushed us through to our second webinar last week with talking around farm profits and community resilience. We had Nick Craddock Henry, who also hosted the event with all of his super skills, Bill Kay Blake and Kenny Bell in there as well, who took a look at the social, economic and cultural impacts of drought as well, which brings us through to today. And just a reminder, if you have missed the live webinars for those first 2 installments, you can catch them online as well. I managed to watch them back too. It's great listening and watching in as well on those 2 webinars, but they have been recorded and they're available online. Easiest way to grab that would be on the chimp mail that came out with the invite to today's event as well. There's some links there, otherwise they're available on YouTube. So it brings us through to today, our 3rd installment for this webinar series. And really the subtopic, I suppose, being what to grow and where our researchers will look at land use changes and adaptation to climate change, including drought, and what changes are need to be made in the policy and decision-making space as well, moving forward. So yeah, just wanted to really acknowledge our webinar speakers for today. We were very fortunate to have 3 amazing speakers, and Gail Osei as well, is Sean Awatere representing Manaaki Whenua Land Research, and Dr. Anita Reiford as well from Lincoln University. I'll let them introduce themselves as we go, but I'm definitely trying to leave some time for our Q&A. So if you do have any questions for our speakers this morning, please use the Q&A box. The chat is open for you to mix and mingle online, but also if you'd like to ask any questions, can you please drop them in the Q&A option that's at the bottom tab as well. That way we can have some live fire questions going across to our speakers at the end in our Q&A section, but also any questions that we don't get to, we're happy to email those on directly to the speakers this morning. And also with our seminar happening, our symposium happening next week on the ground at Te Papa, we can have a follow-up session there. I'll also be your host for that event as well. We've got our speakers in order this morning. We're going to have Anne Gale take up the first reins, followed by Dr. Anita, and then we'll have Sean Awatere as well speaking this morning. Nō reira, I might take the opportunity to introduce Anne Gale and throw the time over to her.
Thank you, Josh. So I'll try to share my screen. Is it working? Okay, good. So thank you for the introduction, Josh. So I'm Anne-Gaëlle Osei from Manaaki Whenua Land Research, and today I'm going to talk about some of the work we've done in the first phase of the National Science Challenge, mainly looking at modeling of different crops under climate change. I will also introduce you to what we're planning to do in the second phase of the project, and this is part of a continued collaboration between the Deep South and our Land and Water. So first I would say that we've looked at different models and done different experiences, I would say, with the modeling. I won't show you everything, but just focus on a few examples to prompt discussions around the drought, and hopefully there will be some further discussion during the in-person symposium next week. But the questions we've addressed so far are things like how much does drought influence biomass production, but also more generically, what do biophysical models tell us about the impacts from future climate change? So the first thing I wanted to show you is an example in the Hawke's Bay. That's a region that we chose to look at because of its the fact that it's a drought-prone region, and we've looked at the pasture production and did some modeling to look at what could be the future impacts of climate change. And I'm showing you some maps based on the work that Lee Scaler from GNS has produced. So what we found is for the different climate change projection, we found that there could be an annual yield increase, mainly due, we think, because of the CO2 fertilization effect. And that could also lead, that fertilization effect can also lead to the plants being more water use efficient. But if we look a bit closer and try to separate the different seasons, we can see that that annual yield increase is different depending on the seasons, with more pasture production compared to today's production in winter or spring, probably because of the warmer temperature. But a decrease in pasture production in summer, probably because of the lack of rain projected into the future. And this could have real implications for irrigation demand. And I would point to some work that NIWA has been doing with MPI, but also in collaboration with Deep South, looking at the change in irrigation supply and demand and the hydrological impacts of climate change. And I think my colleague Christian Zamit is online as well if you've got questions around that that work. What we've done is, because this was a biophysical model taking into account soil, water, climate impacts, but also different management practices, we really wanted to understand what was the contribution of drought versus other climate change variables on the outcome of the pasture production. And what we've done is we've compared two different models, the APSIM model and the BiomeBGC model. And we've done some statistical analysis to understand what are the different influences of those variables. So it confirmed what we thought, that the water-related indices like the potential evapotranspiration deficit, which is an indicator of drought, those indices are the ones that are explaining the most the variability in pasture production. But there are other things that we need to consider. In particular, the soil. The soil type has got a strong influence on pasture production, and other climate attributes. As you can see, it can be up to a third of the explanatory power of the influence of on pasture production. So we need to look at climate change as a whole. It's a whole package. It's not only change in precipitation, but a change in temperature as well. So, and that's what I want to show you here. We've done some modeling as well on other cropping system. This is an example from work led by Plant and Food Research, looking at the maize wheat rotation. And what is shown here is the results from the APSIM modeling, showing on the left what could be the current estimated maize production under current climate. And you can see it tends to be higher in the North Island compared to the South Island. And then on the right-hand side, you've got two scenarios, because that's the beauty of biophysical models, is we can test different scenarios in terms of management practices. The first one, so the middle map, is showing what might happen under climate change if there were no adaptation, so no change in the management practices. And what we can see is that there could be a decline in maize production, especially in the North Island. But if we build into the model some adaptation options that could well be taken into account by the growers, like changing the genotype or sowing the crop earlier in the season, we can see that those adaptation options are counteracting the effects of climate change. And actually, it could lead to some positive outcomes in terms of maize production, especially in the South Island. What we also wanted to look at is other aspects of climate change. So I talked about the change in temperature in particular. This is showing some maps looking at the change in animal heat stress, looking at a well-known index, the temperature humidity index, well known by farmers. Looking at which is really indicating how the animal might suffer from heat, and that could also lead to a decrease in milk production. And what is shown here is that by the end of the century, under the worst RCP scenario, there could be an increase in heat stress in animals, and that change in risk can be spatially different across the country. For instance, under the worst scenario, there could be a higher risk of heat stress in the Canterbury, the Wairarapa, or the Central North Island. So that's something else that needs to be taken into account for future risks. And another example I just wanted to touch on is around the horticultural sector. So here I'm looking at wine grape phenology, because climate change might have an impact on the timing of the different development stages of grape. For instance, we found that using a model on thermal accumulation, there could be an advance in flowering time. Here it's showing an example in the Marlborough for Sauvignon Blanc, where the flowering time by the end of the century could advance by a week. But it does have some implication as well for the other stages like the veraison or the harvesting time. And our modeling is showing that harvesting time under the worst scenario, RCP scenario, could be up to 2 weeks earlier for Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, but up to 4 weeks earlier for Central Otago Pinot Noir. So it does vary depending on the cultivar and the region, which has some implication in terms of compression of time for harvesting and for accessing labor. But this is a long-term shift. What we also need to understand is that this needs to be combined with the added risk of other extreme events. We talk about drought in this symposium, but there's also understanding what could be the implication of that shift in dates with the occurrences of, for instance, hot days, which might increase the risk of a sunburn on grapes, or could affect the welfare of the labor harvesting in the field. But what's the implication on drought risk? We also need to understand how that might coincide with a more or less drought risk during the irrigation demands. So what we're doing now is looking at the next phase of the project, which is really thinking about giving some tools to farmers and decision makers on what could be the next land use options or decision to make in the future. And this is what Annabelle has described earlier. So that's the Fiti Fiti Ora Land Use Opportunities Project led by Our Land and Water. And in this project, we're trying to look at the land use opportunities that are fitting a set of criteria. Not only do we want a future that is environmentally desirable, so limiting the impacts on the environment. Of course, we also want to look at options that are biophysically feasible and economically feasible as well. But most importantly, and I think that's what Sean will talk about later on, we also need to make sure that those options are meeting the community objectives in terms of social and cultural values. And on top of it, there's climate change. So it's complicating the landscape. So we also need to understand how climate change might influence those different options. So if we think about climate change and the different land use options, we usually think about the different adaptation options that are available to the farmers and the growers. And they've usually been defined into 3 categories: tactical adaptation, so that's the day-to-day or year-to-year options that are available to farmers in terms of, as I shown before, changing the sowing date or providing some shading for livestock to counteract the effects of heat stress. But there might be scope to think about more strategic adaptation options, like do we need to think about irrigation infrastructure or developing or establishing new species? And the last one is around transformational adaptation. So if all those different adaptation options have not worked, there may be scope for thinking about a land use change. So what we want to do in the next phase is to think about climate change and understanding the risk. And we can think about risk as a combination of 3 elements: hazards, the sensitivity of the crops to climate change, but also the adaptive capacity. So hazards is straightforward. That's the hazard, the incidence of drought, heat wave, frost, etc. And I think the first webinar has touched upon the risk of drought if you were there for the first webinar. In this case, we might ask questions like, what's the likely incidence of multi-regional droughts? So thinking about not only the regions that we know are already drought prone, but is there a risk for the other regions, and is the drought going to occur simultaneously? But the other aspect we need to account for is understanding how would different land use options react to climate change. And I've shown you some examples during this presentation. And the last aspect is the understanding the capacity of farmers to adopt those tactical, strategic, or transformational options. And that could mean thinking about water storage options. And I'll leave it to Anita to present some of her work and methodology to think about planning for future. But also, we also need to take into account the socioeconomic or cultural factors. And that's a nice introduction to what Sean will present later on. So as a conclusion, we've done some work really trying to think about how climate change might impact from a biophysical point of view on different crops. And I want to stress that there are many compounding effects of climate change, not only drought, which means that we can use those tools, those models to understand what could be the different adaptation strategies now to prepare for the future. And I would also like to finish by saying that we're at the beginning of the second phase of our project. So any feedback is welcome if you're interested in trying to understand or help prioritize the different climate change risks that we're thinking about looking at. Thank you. And I'd like to acknowledge all my co-authors and hard workers doing all the modeling.
Kia ora, Anne, Gail. Thank you very much, and as well, acknowledgements to your team there that you've looked to acknowledge at the end of your presentation. He toa taki tini, with all the support around you. It's some awesome research that's been put forward as well. And so thank you for your presentation this morning. We do have a couple of questions, but I know we've got a Q&A section that we're going to have at the end, just to make sure that we do get through each of our speakers this morning as well. But what I might do is cheekily throw one in just now. The team may throw me a few weird eyebrows like that one, Annabelle. But yeah, we do have a question from Lisa McGlinnicky. Hopefully I've said that right. Is anyone aware of a summary of crop phenologies like the great one that you shared as well that are available for the different growing regions in New Zealand? I suppose that'll be really great information for our people on the ground.
Yeah, that's a great question, because actually I could refer to, so if I stick to one grape, I could refer to some work that is led by Nick Craddock Henry, Deep South Project, where we're thinking about looking not only at phenology and the implication of that shift to the water requirements for grapes. So that's an ongoing project that will continue for the next year or 2 years, I think. Yeah, next 2 years. Otherwise, in terms of summaries of crop phenologies, that's something I was also considering for the next phase of our project, is to think about summarizing the information for different crops, because there's a lot of information out there, but maybe we can create a one-stop shop, basically.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. We will save the other questions for the end. If you do have questions as well, I know a few of them are going into the chat, so if we can throw them into the Q&A, we're going to try and get through as many as we can in the Q&A section at the end of the seminar. But if we don't manage to get to your question as well, we'll be sure to direct that onto our speakers, and we can have some follow-up with our on-the-ground event next week. Otherwise, I'm sure we can follow up with the emails as well. Thank you very much, Anne Gail, for your presentation. We will keep it moving this morning. That's a part of my job as timekeeper. And next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Anita Rieford, who's representing, obviously, Lincoln University. She's an economist and a leader of our Impacts and Implications program. She's experienced across many areas of climate change, including economic evaluations of adaptation and applying robust methods to deal with climate uncertainty as well. And she's going to speak to some of that this morning. Nō reira, e hine, tēnei te mihi ki a koe. I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Anita.
Thanks, Josh. Tēnā koutou katoa. So as Josh mentioned, I'm at the AERU at Lincoln University, and I come from a very interdisciplinary background with a slight focus on economics. So today I'm going to talk about adaptation to some of these drought impacts we've been hearing about, and how we can think about planning under uncertainty. So we heard in earlier earlier webinars about the projections of climate change impacts that we have in New Zealand. And these are great. They give us a really high level, well, actually quite a detailed level of the impacts that we might face around New Zealand. But it's really important to remember when we think about these that there's actually still quite a lot of uncertainty associated with these. So we don't really know what our future societies will look like, what our population will be, what our economies will be. We don't know how effective our mitigation will be globally. So we don't know which of those emissions pathways we're going to be on. Then when it comes to modelling, there are inherent uncertainties in the climate models that we use. And as we bring these down to more regional levels, each level of analysis adds another layer of uncertainty. And the more local that we come, actually, the more the uncertainty layers increase. So by the time we start thinking about adaptation, we've actually got quite a large envelope of uncertainty there. And we can reduce some of these uncertainties across these different areas, but some of it is not going to be able to be reduced. We just have to live with it. So we have to learn to make decisions despite this uncertainty. Now, when we think about adaptation decision making, this can be quite challenging because we have different timeframes involved. So we have the current impacts that we're already seeing, and then as we go through, we're starting to see or we're understanding what the changes might be in the short to medium term and the longer term. But the further we look out, the more the uncertainty increases. So we go from quite low uncertainty, obviously, now to high in the future. And when we think about adaptation, this can present challenges, obviously. So the kind of thinking that we have really is that for the impacts that we're observing, we can do things on the ground in response to these, and ideally they'll have benefits for other systems as well. For the medium term impact, so then the short to medium term, so 10, 20 years or so, we can start to incorporate adaptation into our decision making so that the changes that we make are resilient. So if there's an opportunity to invest in more land, for example, we might think about it being in an area that is suitable or is likely to continue to be suitable for the kind of production we want, or knowing what we know about climate change. But for the longer term, ideally we'd avoid making decisions now that lock us into the longer term. So really robust things are things like planning, monitoring, gathering data so that we know what kind of pathway we're on. Also thinking about like breeding new species and varieties. So across these timeframes, there are roles for both the private and the public decision making, and the things like breeding and species development might be the role for industry. So in general, we kind of encourage people to think about being flexible and not locking ourselves into long-term decisions. But in some cases, there are decisions that we need to make that are, we have to make them now, and they do have long-term consequences. And when we think about drought, this is from a paper that I did, I think it was based in the UK, but some of the analysis might be useful for thinking about adaptation here. But yeah, when we think about drought, an adaptation that often comes up is water storage for irrigation. And water storage is really useful to allow us to smooth out some of the variability associated with changes in climate. And I'll just show you this figure, which was some analysis that Christian Zammit at NIWA did as part of a project for us, which was looking at the storage requirements for a particular location out to 2049. And you can see each of these different lines is a different a general circulation model and RCP, so future climate scenario combination. So you can see that there's quite a variety within these. And if we look out to 2090, you can see that every line is looking very different, from quite flat to and actually very little increase in water storage requirements to a lot of differences. And if we're thinking about building a dam to store water, what pathway would we choose? It's very challenging. And so this is where a project that I was leading until last year tried to help answer some of these questions. So we were looking at water storage for climate change, and we're applying a methodology called real options analysis, which helps with some of these difficult questions. So it's very suitable when we do have these large irreversible investments that will be around for a long time. So they're a long-lived kind of asset. And the idea is that we leave options open in the future. So we've got the right, but not the obligation to act on these options. And with water storage, the idea is that when you construct your dam now, you allow flexibility so that you can extend it if you need to in the future. And so because you don't really want to build a massive dam that maybe turns out to be an overinvestment if you end up having more water available in the future than you expected. On the other hand, you don't want to build something too small and then not have the capacity to extend that if you need to. So it does build on the cost benefit analysis essentially, but it includes and puts a value on flexibility, and it allows for a range of climate futures. So we actually look at all of those future water requirements that I showed you in the previous graphs. So it's quite a different kind of investment appraisal tool than your traditional one that would just assume one fixed path. And so we looked at all those RCP GCM combinations for every year. I'm going to go into the detail of the methods, but just to give you a rough idea. And we developed this decision tree, which has the opportunity to make a decision now and at some time in the future. And you can choose those times. We just chose 2050 in our example. And then you basically construct a decision tree, which has, in this case, 256 branches. So there's quite a lot of analysis involved. And each of those branches calculates the costs and benefits of having the water available, as well as the likelihood of that branch. So it gives you the expected net present value. So this allows you to select the size that is the most cost effective, given what we know about the future climates. And that's the key thing. So this is just an example of some of the results. So when we assumed that each of the future climate were equally likely, the analysis showed that it would be most cost effective to build the smallest storage size now, and at 2050 also only to expand it by the smallest possible amount. It wouldn't cover all our water requirements in every year, but because of the costs involved and the benefits, that's the most cost-effective decision. But when we assumed that the lowest and the highest scenario were less likely than the two middle climate scenarios, it actually the most cost-effective size was to build the slightly bigger one in the first year. So although this raises questions about, well, how do we know which climate scenario we're on? And this is, unresolved and challenging. But I think it does highlight that it is really worth examining the full range of potential futures before we're going to invest in some of these large, long-lived assets, such as water storage. It comes up a lot when we're talking about drought. But really it is definitely important to consider the whole range of futures. So I'm just going to introduce you to a project that is just began at the end of last year. It's also funded through the Deep South, and it has a number of collaborators that you can see on screen here. So we're focusing on the dairy sector, and we're really taking quite a cross-disciplinary approach. We're looking at biophysical impacts of drought. We're also looking at other impacts, including heat stress and flooding. But drought is part of it. So looking at the impacts of these and adaptation approaches. We're looking at economics, the costs of the impacts and the costs and benefits of adaptation, as well as the costs of not adapting. And we're also basing this in on the ground by interviewing farmers about their experiences with weather such as droughts in the past and how they intend to adapt in the future, and we'll be developing adaptation pathways with them. So it's really trying to bring a lot of these different areas of analysis together. And we want to answer questions such as this one, which is like, at what point does an increasing frequency of droughts trigger land use change? And so hopefully we can inform that through the biophysical modelling, the economics, and the stakeholders and the farmer engagement, because I think we need to bring all these different approaches together to try and get a really good picture of our options and the implications of them. So just in conclusion, I think it's really critical that we start developing new ways of thinking and learning when we talk about adapting to climate change. It's not straightforward. We have a lot of uncertainty. And if we can start using different types of tools, trying them out, and seeing how they can help us make decisions, that's really important. And I think, yeah, just to leave on the note that uncertainty is challenging, but it's definitely not a reason for inaction. And unfortunately, sorry, I don't have a list of collaborators like Anne Gale did, but there were a lot of people involved in both of these projects that I mentioned. Thank you.
Kia ora, Dr. Anita, and thank you for that presentation as well. And always te tohu o te rangatira, or the sign of a chief, is one that acknowledges the people that have helped them get to where they are as well. And with that awesome work there, yeah, congratulations, and thank you for your presentation. I might just sneakily throw in another question. I am keeping an eye on our time as well, and we should still have time for Q&A at the end. But I think this one really centers around the RRA process, and this one from Rebecca as well, who asked, Anita, did this research also consider the environmental costs of increasing the water take into the storage structure in terms of the costs and benefits ratio for these options?
That is a great question. And no, it didn't. We were just, I guess, demonstrating the approach at quite a simplistic level, but we've been talking about other ways that we can extend it. And that would be one of them, absolutely.
Ka pai, we're going to leave the other questions we've got here. Oh, and they're flowing in now. And also for you, Dr. Anita, so we'll grab you again at the end there. Just in regards to the Q&A, if we can keep our questions, if you do have a question, please ask them in the Q&A tab as well. We're getting a few pop up in the chat, and that's okay. There is in the chat as well quite a few documents and links that have been shared in there to some of the work that our speakers this morning have carried out as well already, some of their reports and papers. And other information just to help find those answers ourselves as well. And also following this event today, like the others, an evaluation email will be circulated as well, and we appreciate your feedback too. Keeping it moving this morning, because I do see we are ticking away on time. Thank you, Dr. Anita. We'll move on to our next speaker, Sean Awatere. So we go back to Manaaki Whenua Land Care Research. Again now within our webinar, a senior kairangahau and a theme leader with Ngā Pai o Te Māramatanga as well, New Zealand's Māori Centre of Research Excellence. Sean's work is, yeah, it's amazing. It involves improving the incorporation of Māori values into economic decision making for collective assets that will enable Māori organisations to make more kaupapa Māori attuned decisions. So we're going to look into mātauranga Māori and that interface with Western science as well, and how we ensure that these adaptation techniques and options align with our values as well. Nō reira, e te rangatira e Sean, ka tuku nā te rākau kōrero ki a koe. Introducing Sean Awatere, ladies and gentlemen.
Tēnā koe hoa, o tira kia ora tātou, he mihi tēnei kia koutou, ko huihui mai nei tēnei wā. Sean Awatere ahau, he kairangahau mō Manaaki Whenua Land Care Research. I'm presenting this webinar on behalf of my colleague, Nikki Harcourt. And this will be a Māori agribusiness case study that helps inform the Whiti Whiti Ora project within the future landscapes theme of our land and water. And the case study will showcase the operationalisation of a holistic decision-making framework for on-farm decision-making that elevates mātauranga Māori thinking alongside Western science and knowledge systems to inform decision makers to make better decisions and better adapt to the challenges of climate change, like drought. So as Indigenous peoples, and within the current context, it requires us to empower and equalise Māori worldviews, values and knowledge systems. need to move away from a dominating paradigm where Māori perspectives are present but often unequally considered, if at all. And we also need to be aware that in some instances, Māori knowledge and values are housed within other paradigms, other worldviews. However, for a holistic and unique land management paradigm to work in Aotearoa, we need to ensure that we have two equal sized cogs in the wheel that are not needing to be validated against each other. And this needs to be reflected against the whole spectrum of land management, from governance, decision making, through to the implementation and support of our kaimahi on the ground. So we recently completed a project working with a committee of management for a Māori farm trust to develop a decision-making framework for selecting alternative afforestation options to be more resilient to the challenges of climate change. So we're going to reflect here on some of the key learnings for how a holistic decision-making framework for on-farm decision-making can help empower more resilient livelihoods. So we worked with the Committee of Management for Whakatawai Station, a 560 plus hectare station that's currently leased for sheep and beef grazing. So many of the Committee of Management and the shareholders of Whakatawai, they live outside of their rohe, outside of their traditional homelands, due to few opportunities being available in order to generate sustainable livelihoods. So this has led to a progressive disconnection between the shareholders, as well as a disconnection of between the shareholders and their land and their knowledge relating to that land. And the Committee of Management are wanting to seek to change this type of behaviour. So the 150 plus shareholders all whakapapa to Ngāti Porou. The Whakatawai Station is located in Ruatoria in the Waipu Valley on the east coast of the North Island. Those of you who are familiar with the area, you will know that it's geographically fairly isolated, being about 1.5 hours drive up from the coast from Gisborne. So there's numerous historical reports recount how prosperous these settlements were. So Ngāti Porou have been in the Waipu for about 600 years. And then in 1840, it was recorded that 80 to 90% of the Waipu catchment was in indigenous forests. And small clearings have been made to enable food cultivation for key crops, including kumara and taro. So cultivation was tightly matched to the landscape, to the most appropriate microclimates, and activities were undertaken in reciprocity with the taiao, with the natural environment. And this philosophy lent itself to mosaics of activity across the landscape. Since the 1980s, there's been active encouragement by government schemes and incentives to convert land into pastoral farms. Now, this has led to a focus on primary production in areas that are probably unsuitable, with associated negative impacts on those surrounding natural systems and receiving environments. So for Māori, Ngāti Porou in the Waipu Valley, deforestation has led to increased erosion and sedimentation of the key waterway, including the Waipu River, and the loss of indigenous biodiversity. And this has had a profound impact on cultural values and their enactment. So the alignment to values. So one of the realities facing the Committee of Management, the current decision makers of Māori land, is that there are numbers of people involved in making decisions by virtue of multiple ownership. So the older Committee of Management members tend to adopt quite a conservative approach to land use activities. Sheep and beef is the core of the activities that they have known for some time now. But there's a new group of committee members who are coming through who wanting to step up and ensure that they're not reliant on the farm advisors to tell them what their options are or what knowledge is appropriate for making those decisions. So as a result, We are supporting these decision makers who are interested in making more culturally attuned or culturally aligned types of decisions. I represent here a Māori values-based framework. The framework is situated within 3 core values: kaitiakitanga or sustainable management, manaakitanga, reciprocity, whakatipu rawa, growing the asset base for future generations. So utilising this framework, media management or trustees can clarify the impact of an activity or propose farm-based activity on the land use opportunities within all land use opportunities within the context of these core values. It should also be noted that the governance groups, committees of management, can also define what these values mean for themselves and how they can prioritise them. This framework ought to be utilised alongside other information like financial information and biophysical data to provide for the holistic decision making. So kōrero ngātahi, providing that advice. In providing that advice to the Committee of Management, we took the following approach. We walked the whenua with Committee of Management and other landowners, shareholders, and shared the knowledge about the biophysical observation, the cultural significance in some of those areas on our farms, and the special meanings that those culturally significant areas have. And we discussed the potential economic returns from undertaking different activities according to the biophysical attributes as well as the cultural feasibility. So place-based knowledge about what has grown historically on a site is incredibly useful, along with the microclimate considerations. And they provide useful examples of robust guidance in terms of what is feasible on that landscape. We also did a follow-up Zoom call with our shareholders and committee management members to mark significant sites on the land parcels. And this was a particularly useful and successful way of drawing out that knowledge, particularly for those who were disconnected or unable to make it back to an on-site wānanga or on-site workshop on the farm. At the same time, this type of process enabled us to understand where those places that are suitable for the types of activities that we're exploring and the appropriate species and the combinations of species that were informed by the locally based Māori knowledge. So here's the couple of photos of the case study block. It's a 10-hectare area with 3 distinct soil types. And as indicated, the site has a number of areas that are of significance to the landowners. Here's an example of some of the key visual soil landform and corresponding vegetation characteristics of the particular soil in this area, which was the hydroclay soil zone. From a Māori values perspective, the landowners and committee of management knew that kumara was never grown in this particular area because of the pale type coloured soils. And from technical knowledge, we know that the pale soils are also nutrient poor. And we could see together, that the pale colour of the soil, along with the types of plants that were growing in the area, like buttercups and the wee rushes, they were also indicators of the quality of that soil. So both knowledge systems provide us with data to inform us around which species are likely to grow on that landscape and which are the species that are more likely to be resilient to climate change impacts like drought and flooding. So this final framework enabled us to align the two knowledge systems around the value domains that resonated with the Committee of Management. So how does this framework help facilitate decision making? So once we identify the biophysical attributes of the site and the known history about what grows there or what has grown there in the past, we're able to rank a list of plant species according to the perceived impacts on biodiversity, erosion, and environmental vitality, or from a Māori perspective, MODI. The potential to reconnect the landowners back to that whenua, back to that land, through utilising traditional ways of of knowing, including rongoa or Māori medicine and raranga or weaving. And the potential to stimulate economic impact, that's always important as well. Needs to be considered alongside the biophysical as well as those cultural values. But the economic impact in this way was seen through the lens of an intergenerational timeframe. What is the economic impact or benefits for our grandchildren and their children as well? So if you're thinking about the types of soils that we identified in the example, you can see that there's specific plants like karakeke, manuka and other species that will grow in these zones, and that can make help us inform to make those decisions around our planting plan. So manuka is a taonga species and was part of the ancestral landscape of Whakatawa in the past. It generates high value honey and oil, but a manuka monoculture is probably deemed less attractive in comparison to a mix of species, because this scenario creates more biodiversity and would also enable the local supply of plant-based medicines and the development of sustainable plant extract business. So by enabling the trustees to evaluate the alternative land uses against their core values and principles, they were able to conclude that the potential loss of revenue from retiring some of the blocks for planting and the costs associated with this, including fencing, pest management, and the like, was offset by the long-term benefits of environmental mitigation. And in the mid to long term, this activity will facilitate better connection between landowners and their whenua through workshops that will transfer the knowledge regarding traditional plant use. And it may also provide an opportunity for both current learning and a resource for future generations. So it has potential to support high levels of community involvement through plant propagation and harvesting. So in conclusion, reconnecting, restoring and revitalising the connections between whānau, families and their whenua and their land, ancestral knowledge like mātauranga Māori, customary protocols like tikanga and language te reo is key to adapting to the challenges of climate change. Taking a more holistic approach to farm planning, incorporating the technical wisdom of conventional farm advisors and scientific testing methods alongside kaupapa Māori assessments offers potential and possibilities for sustainable agribusiness through creating mosaics of land uses that are more resilient and more prosperous. He mihi anō ki ngā kaitiaki o te whenua, ara ngā whakatūtu ai wānei, Whakatawai Station and their shareholders. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Sean. Awesome kōrero. And thank you for sharing that information with us as well. It's really interesting. We are going to open up for some Q&A now as well. So if people have any more questions, just please feel free to throw them into the Q&A section. And reason being is it's because it kind of formalizes them, and if need be, we can follow up accordingly with emails, etc., or even a follow-up next week on the ground at our event. Sean, I just a quick question as well, and following the Māori values framework that you've got there and the other factors that our people on the ground need to take into consideration. And you mentioned as well new whānau coming into some of these boards and land trusts as well, and looking for the new thing, the new options in this new world. You did mention Manuka. Were there any other options, sustainable options that the whānau there entertained at that particular land block?
Yeah, there are a number of other types of honeys, Te Urewa honey, Kānaka oil, for example. I guess the issue that needs to be made is what is the market that people are going to be supplying for? Is it going to be a locally based market? Or is it going to be bulk supply for export? And those are some decisions that people need to make and consider, because I think that you need an infrastructure and industry around those types of opportunities in order to realise them. And those are some of the challenges that some people face, particularly in those more isolated areas. So more sustainable options will focus on locally based entrepreneurial activities, i.e. for their local community.
Into account. If you would like to well, read more around some of Sean's work as well as Nikki's, they've got a chapter within the book Whakarite Whakaaro Whanake Whenua, Kaupapa Māori Decision Making Frameworks for Alternative Land Use, which can be found at WICCLS as well, and we've dropped the link into the chat too. So yeah, check that out, whānau. We're going to go through a few more of these questions that we've got here as well. And Anne Gale, we're going to dart back to you, because I think this question from Alvaro Romero was asked around, you mentioned that some of the effects from drought and climate change as well. And Alvaro made the comment that some of those effects seem quite mild. Did you want to make any comment to that as well?
Mild, yeah, well, I guess it depends on what we're looking at, but in fact, it's quite informative sometimes to know if it's mild or extreme. So at least it helps redirect where are the different risks and opportunities. So what it's showing is that, as I said, climate change is an ensemble of things, but we need really to understand how those mild effects that you're talking about might interact with other effects of climate change. So it's a bit like what Sean is talking about. It's looking at the whole picture and the holistic aspects. So.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely. We're going to move through with our questions as well. I did see there too, Heather Collins. Yeah, thank you very much. We will make reference to the paper as well, Awatere and Harcourt in 2021, for more reading for everybody. Yes. So just going through our Q&A. If you do have any more questions, feel free to throw them in there. We've got a couple more minutes while we're still open in this webinar. Let's have a look here.
Shall we answer Graham Card's question, Josh? It's another one for Anne Gale.
It is.
Yeah, thank you, Graham. I was looking at that question as well. It's a great question, because that's what we want to look at in the Whiti Whiti Ora project, is to think about the different options. And we've done some work, and we're going to build on some other work that we've done for MPI as well, as part of a collaboration with Plant and Food and Ag Research. And NIWA as well. So we are gathering all the growing requirements for different crops, and we're thinking about the different options that we could look at. And that includes different horticultural options. So it might be, because those maps or those models will be at national scale, I think we could look at the Gisborne area as well and think about what might be more suitable compared to kiwi fruit or things that are less water hungry.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we do know that, especially here in Tauranga Moana, that kiwi fruit, yeah, it needs a whole lot of irrigation, a whole lot of water as well. So it's awesome to weigh that up holistically, like how Sean had mentioned there as well. Thanks very much, Anne. Any other questions you can see in there?
Josh, I see there's one which is sort of questioning about why we're looking at constructing dams, because we should be thinking about recycling water. So I could take a stab at that. I mean, I'm not sure whether there is work going on about water recycling. There's definitely work about like conserving water and how we use water more efficiently for irrigation and other uses. NIWA has done some work on that space. But I think, water storage has to still be in the mix of adaptation options, and it doesn't have to be large scale ones either. It can be on farm, and it just is a way to help smooth out some of that variability that we're going to see, and it will take the pressure off the rivers potentially. So
awesome. Ka pai. We'll probably look to follow up with any more questions as well. I'm not sure who this question is for. We do have one there. from Gian or Frank Liu, wondering if, well, I suppose I'm not sure who this is for, which speaker this is for, but wondering if you will consider pest and disease impact under climate changes and how those impacts will affect productivities. Would any of our speakers like to comment on that?
I can comment briefly. There is already a bunch of work that has been done on pest invasion and disease risk under climate change. So under Whiti Ora, I think the first step will be to gather that information of things that are already going on. We'll be looking at some of the risks for things like facial eczema, for instance, or thinking about animal welfare. That's one aspect. Looking into how that might affect productivity, it's a step further. The modeling is usually not there to think about how pest and disease is affecting productivity, and in the biophysical modeling space that I've seen. But we can think about adding it as an extra layer of information and yeah, looking at qualitative ways of thinking about it and bringing it, consider it in the framework.
Awesome. We're going to have to follow up with the rest of our questions next week. So it probably is a good segue into giving our symposium a little bit more promotion as well. So growing kai under increasing dry, we've had the roll-on webinars, this being the third, and then pushing into our symposium, which is happening next week, Monday, the 31st of May at Te Papa in Wellington. You can register still and make it in the door down there on the ground at that event. Otherwise, it is going to be available as well to be able to tune in online. So we encourage you to do that as well. There are some interactive activities throughout the day too. So you'll be sure to get some great outcomes by attending online too. We've got that link in our chat as well. So an easy click on there to register for the online attendance. If you can't make it in person, there's a great program that just got released and sent out yesterday, and that's available online as well. But as for today, for our third and final webinar in our series, just like to thank our speakers very much. Angel Osei, Sean Awatere of Manaaki Whenua Landcare Research, and also Dr. Anita Reford from Lincoln University. Thank you very much for your māramatanga, your knowledge, and the awesome work that you're doing out there for resilience for our nation as well. Tēnā koutou, o tira koutou katoa, kua hono mai ki tēnei wānanga ipurangi o te rangi nei, tēnā koutou, ngā manaaki tanga nui, kia koutou o tira tātou katoa. And just acknowledgements to everybody that's tuned in today. Thank you very much. If you have come in halfway through and missed a part, this will be recorded. This whole session is being recorded and it'll be thrown up online as well for you to look at another date that suits you too. Nō reira, whakairihia ngā kōrero me ngā whakaaro nui ki runga, kia whakawāta i te ara tāne, kia tūruki whakatahai, haumi e, hui e, tā iki e. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We'll see you next week.